This man was president of the United States, and he couldn't even get through an entire meeting without his wife being like, what he meant to say was...
And even before that, he was a Hollywood actor, and if Twitter has taught me anything, those people should not be listened to.
Yeah, yes, also that.
Hello and welcome to the show. I'm your host, Reginald Bärris, a stand-up comedian, but more importantly, a concerned citizen. And I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Sid Singh. Introduce yourself.
Hey, I'm Sid Singh, and I'm also a comedian, but more importantly, I'm an unlicensed attorney, here to give you all the facts with none of the credentials, other than the law degree.
The credentials, not the authority. We're not going to solve anything with this podcast, but we are going to take a look, because this week's nightmare, Trump has fired the National Security Advisor, Mike Walz, and replaced him with Marco Rubio, who's already Trump's Secretary of State. So we're here to answer the question on all of our minds. Can they just do that? But first, a word from our sponsors. This week's episode is sponsored by our patrons at patreon.com/dothatpod. Basically, right now, the show is free for everyone but us. And we're just some broke boy comedians, so it all adds up very quickly. There's equipment, hosting fees, other production costs, yada, yada, yada. And right now, Sid and I are going out of pocket to foot that bill. But by joining our patreon.com/dothatpod, you can get early access to videos and even get your name in the credits as a Patreon producer. Our goal here at Can They Just Do That is to help you make sense of the news and know your rights. And if you'd like to support us in that goal, we would love to welcome you in to our patreon.com/dothatpod. Link is in the description. Back to the show. So let's start with some context. In the wake of the Signalgate embarrassment, where Mike Walz accidentally blah, 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 watch our episode about it.
Yeah, basically, Donald Trump has removed Waltz from his post as the National Security Advisor, making him the first senior member of the administration to leave the White House in Trump 2.0.
However, Trump also announced that he would be nominating Mike Walz as an ambassador to the United Nations, so it's less like he's getting fired and more like he's getting transferred, the same way Catholic priests get sent to another parish after getting handsy with the children.
Waltz's political embarrassment is bound to follow him to his confirmation hearings for the UN position. So even with Republicans holding a strong majority in the Senate, it's still pretty possible that his nomination goes nowhere.
After the announcement, Trump truthed out a social, thanking Waltz for his work and stating that the National Security Advisor would, at least temporarily, be Secretary of State Marco Rubio. So that begs the question, who's going to be the Secretary of State? Also Marco Rubio.
Now, Waltz's actual replacement is expected to be Steve Witkoff, who is currently a special envoy to the Middle East. But for the time being, Rubio will now be the first official to simultaneously serve both the Secretary of State and National Security Advisor since Henry Kissinger half a century ago. Rubio was also, for the record, the acting head of the gutted USAID, and he's technically the head of the National Archives right now.
That's so many jobs. And the audacity of Elon to say,
they say I wear a lot of hats. Even my hat has a hat.
When Marco Rubio's over here looking like Bartholomew Gubbins.
What? What is that reference?
It's a Dr. Seuss book.
Oh. Okay.
Mike Waltz being removed from his position as National Security Advisor makes him the first cabinet member in Trump 2.0 to be removed from the White House. And I have to imagine that Trump was giddy as a schoolgirl to finally get to look someone in the eyes and say, you're fired. But like we mentioned earlier, this is kind of difficult to view it as a firing when it feels more like a transfer. And I'm not sure enough about the hierarchy of all these positions to confidently call it a lateral move from Mike Waltz. But at the very least, it feels like what the business world would call a golden parachute. But Sid, I feel like our perspectives are a little bit different on this. So what are your views?
Okay, so based on my research about this, I kind of got a bunch of different answers. But essentially, because Trump respects what Waltz gave up to have the job, which was he had a pretty cushy congressional job as a representative, he kind of gave him a soft landing because, so based on my research, he appointed Waltz to be the UN ambassador, a spot they still have not been able to fill because they don't actually think Waltz is likely to get confirmed for the spot. So Trump probably never said you're fired. He's kind of hoping the Senate does it for him.
You say that it's unlikely that he'll be confirmed as the ambassador, but I'm curious why you feel that way, because my understanding is that the president nominates a candidate for the ambassadorship, and then the Senate will vote for confirmation. And seeing as Republicans have a strong control of the Senate with a 53 seats to the Democrats' 45, to me, it doesn't seem like it's particularly difficult to get that approved, especially if Trump wanted to put his thumb on the scales at all, since he clearly doesn't respect checks and balances in the first place.
I think this kind of speaks to, I don't think the Trump administration fired him for Signalgate, which is a thing we'll get to. I think they fired him for other reasons. However, I think the reason Waltz would have a really hard time getting confirmed is that he's become the face of that scandal because he's the one who included the journalist. And as a result, I think a lot of armed forces loving Republicans really would have a problem voting for him to get confirmed, especially if Trump doesn't want to put his thumb on the proverbial scales. I mean, this isn't anything new. The UN ambassadorship was supposed to go to Elise Stefanik, who is a congresswoman from New York City, who has basically said and done a bunch of crazy things at the behest of Trump, and she couldn't get confirmed.
My understanding of why she couldn't get confirmed is because there were two Democrat people in Congress that were running in Florida that looked pretty promising, and they didn't want to give up that seat from a Republican candidate. Couldn't that be a different situation than this one, though?
You mean to say that they don't think they could have won Stefanik's seat in New York City? Staten Island, I believe.
Look, man, I'll be honest. I don't know what I meant. I'm repeating something I heard once.
But this sort of speaks to the crazy calculations that the Trump administration has to do. And yet, you saw this again with Mike Davis, I believe is the guy's name, who was going to be like an associate attorney general, had to step down because the Senate wouldn't confirm him. Tom Tillis, who is a leading senator and Republican, and very Republican, was like, I'm sorry, I just can't vote for a guy who defended so many of the January 6th people, which is why you're getting a Judge Jeanine Pirro from Fox News as the temporary replacement.
I guess it is fair that we are at a point where not everybody's as Teflon as Donald Trump himself. And as much as he could put his thumb on the scales, he's not necessarily going to, because he's a selfish, spiteful.
And he is a coward. I think people forget that just because his television show would have him say the phrase, "you're fired," doesn't mean in real life he's actually very good at firing anyone. I don't know if you remember this, but in the first term, he hired Omarosa, who was a cast member from The Apprentice. And apparently they tried to fire her multiple times. And every time they did, she would barge into his office, which again is the Oval Office of the White House. Yeah. And she would demand to be unfired, and Trump apparently caved almost every single time.
I mean, yeah, it also probably is worth saying, as much as The Apprentice makes him say you're fired to people, I don't think CEOs are usually the person firing people.
No.
I think you can be the CEO of a bunch of companies and never have to say the words "you're fired" to somebody's face.
100%.
And also just, I think he's generally willing to tip the scales when something actually matters or affects him directly. When it's something that affects one of his hangers-on, he's willing to give you the nod, as you see with like Mike Gates, for example, where it's like, hey, I want you on here despite all of your sex crime allegations. And then the moment people are like, hey, what about those sex crime allegations? He's like, well, I tried. And then just walks away.
Yeah. I think that's 100% correct. I mean, it's also weird because it does feel like they kind of let Mike Waltz go in this way, partially to protect Pete Hegseth, which kind of goes to the Signalgate fallout, which I know is our next point here.
Yeah, because I think it's worth saying that when we had an episode about Signalgate 1.0, and then, they did it again, and we didn't follow up on it. But, when 1.0 happened, we did anticipate somebody getting fired, and we did say specifically, you'd hope someone would get fired for a blunder like this. But at this point, I am kind of surprised that they did go through with firing anybody, even if it is only on the auspice of being involved in that, because the Trump administration is known for their whole strong and wrong media strategy, which is just refusing to admit any mistake until the problem eventually blows over. And for Mike Waltz's part in Signalgate, I feel like it was working, because once Signalgate 2.0 happened, where Pete Hegseth said one more time, but with feeling, then it feels like that took enough of the heat off of Waltz onto Pete Hegseth. And we're like, okay, so who cares who added it? Pete Hegseth keeps doing this stuff. He keeps making the same mistake over and over again, including, I think a lot of us are not surprised at the idea that somebody who's in his position might make their wife privy to some of the information that's supposed to be classified. Couples talk. You're not necessarily supposed to do it, but you're not surprised. But in person over dinner, not in the group chat that you've invited her to. And I think when you see that, it's like, okay, so Pete Hegseth is clearly the problem here. And since they are fine with leaving him praised and unpunished, why even bother getting rid of Waltz? I feel like Waltz must have felt like he was in the clear at this point.
Well, and that's why I think to me, it's very clear that this is cover for something else. I just think behind the scenes, Waltz must have been ruffling feathers. He must not be hiring enough MAGA types to be on his staff. He must not be punishing enough normies. Like, I really think that Signalgate is almost at this point a coincidence to Waltz getting fired. I don't think Trump is willing to admit a mistake like that. I still think if pressed, he wouldn't admit a mistake like that. I just think if they actually wanted to fire him, they would have fired him way earlier. And I think they're doing it now to be like, okay, well, you guys wanted us to do something, so now we've done something and you can leave us alone.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's impossible to know. I mean, we're kind of just like, sometimes this show just turns into us doing sports commentary about politics.
Which is what I've always wanted to do.
I know, I can hear it in your cadence.
I know.
Suddenly, they got a strong base.
Suddenly, Sid came alive on the episode.
But I think, much like Donald Trump, I don't waste my time with losers. So enough with Mike Walz. Yeah. Let's get on to the topic of this, which is Marco Rubio taking on all these different positions in the cabinet. To me, that seems like weird that you can have one person in charge of all these things. But before we even get into whether or not that is allowed or should be allowed, we should probably, discuss what the presidential cabinet actually is. So, Sid, can you break it down for the listeners who aren't as cool and well-informed as me, who definitely already knows the answer to this question?
Exactly. So the Cabinet of the United States is the principal official advisory body to the President of the United States. It basically consists of the Vice President and all the officials that are the head of the departments the President deems worthy to be super important. Now, it's important to note that the Vice President does not actually have any authority over the President's cabinet. He's kind of just there. And all the cabinet officials directly report to the President. So there is no middleman in the situation. Now, there's roughly 26 members, the Vice President, 15 department heads, and 10 cabinet level officials, all of except 3 of whom require Senate confirmation. And this is not, always the case. Back when we had George Washington, our first president, they really only had 5 members in the cabinet. So as the job of the executive gets more and more complex, the president is actually expected to continue to expand his cabinet in order to fulfill all of his duties as president.
I will say that I find it very funny that, like, the way you've described it makes it sound like the vice president is almost an elected cabinet member. I know that's not the case, but I do enjoy thinking of J.D. Vance sitting at the kids' table. So I'm going to keep it in my head as if it's true. But as you said, the point of the cabinet is to surround the president with a wide array of advisors to the various sectors of the government, which is why they expect it to keep expanding as the world gets more complex. We have toilets now, and you got to have somebody for that. So it does make sense that the decision is realistically affecting the whole world. You should have people who know what they're talking about instead of one person who may be doing things on a whim, hypothetically. But if you're going to rely on the guidance of a lot of people's voices, I think it is interesting to point out that you said there's 26 members, but in this case, it's more accurate to say there's 26 seats. And if one person holds more than one position, then that's lowering the number of actual individual people that the president can refer to for advice, which seems, to me at least, to be a bit ill-advised. But what does the Constitution say? Because, I will say, caveat, I know that the words, is that legal or is that constitutional, often get conflated, even though they don't necessarily mean the same thing. So I suppose at the heart of my question, what I'm actually asking is 2 parts. Is that allowed? And separately, what does the Constitution have to say about the cabinet?
Right. So in Article 2, Section 2, Clause 1, the Constitution does not actually explicitly establish a cabinet. However, what it does do is essentially infer that there are going to be principal officers of the departments who provide advice to the president. So essentially, none of them have to be there, but technically the Constitution just sort of assumed that he'd have them. Basically, let me break this down. The reason we did this episode is for this next point. So I wrote my paper in law school about the 25th Amendment. The 25th Amendment basically clearly defines the order of succession for the president. It kind of became a big deal after the JFK assassination for obvious reasons.
What happened?
Yeah. I'll let you guys guess what those obvious reasons are. But it basically was like something that had kind of been talked about for like 50 years prior to the assassination, because a lot of presidents were playing fast and loose with what they would allow their vice president to do. For example, FDR was notorious for almost never even meeting the vice presidents. I think Truman met FDR all of once in his job as vice president, which is crazy to fathom happening now, where J.D. Vance literally sits in every cabinet meeting. The amendment also has a clause that basically states that should the president be incapacitated for either mental or physical reasons, that the vice president, along with a simple majority of the cabinet, can effectuate his removal from office. So this is important because so long as Rubio is now holding roughly 2 cabinet level jobs and somehow 4 in total, he theoretically is making it easier or harder for the president to one day be removed from mental incapacity. Basically, if Rubio is now taking up 2 seats, so now there's only, let's say, 25, and let's say someone else like Hegseth gets fired in the next 2 weeks, then instead of needing 14 votes, we might need as few as 12 votes to suddenly have a majority within the cabinet. When I say that, you go, well, that's perfect. Trump is clearly mentally incapacitated, and they can now get rid of him whenever they want to. But unfortunately, not so fast, because the history of the United States is a history of covering up for presidents who are almost always mentally incapacitated.
I will also say, even before you go back too far in the history, which I know you're going to do, for me, even if we ignore all of what you're about to say, I can't get too excited about, well, he's clearly incapacitated, because Biden ruined that bar.
Yeah.
That is one of my most, one of the most frustrating things about Biden. I mean, there's a lot of frustrating things about Biden, but one of the things that frustrates me the most is that we can't point out how clearly old and doddering Donald Trump is. He is the oldest president ever elected. The past 3 presidents have successfully been the oldest ever elected each time, breaking that record. And you can see it. He is not as sharp. He's confused. He's impressed that his son knows how to turn on a laptop at when he's college age. He ostensibly, I don't know if I'm supposed to uphold the Constitution. And look, is he lying with that one? Yes, but at the same time, it feels like he's slipping, but it doesn't look like he's slipping when you compare it to Biden's abject failings at communicating. He doesn't look all that old by comparison. So even if we do feel like he's slipping, I already wouldn't think people are going to be like, this is so obvious that he needs to be removed, even if we didn't take into the rest of the historical context. But I'm sure, as you said, there is a history of this. So I'd love to hear it.
It's, the worst part about it is that, if anything, Biden's probably the first Democrat to be so brazen about these things, because historically speaking, it's almost always been Republicans for really shady political reasons. And that's despite the fact that multiple times in the history of the United States, not only has a president been mentally incapacitated, but it's happened when there's been a huge national security emergency. So, for example, when Nixon was president, Spiro Agnew had to resign in order to avoid getting impeached. That was his vice president. And Nixon was going to resign for Watergate scandals. But in between those two things, before Gerald Ford, Nixon's successor, was allowed to become vice president, Nixon was the president, and technically the next person in line was the Speaker of the House, who was a Democrat, which means that should Nixon be declared, incapacitated, a Democrat would have taken office.
Which I think we can all agree. Yeah.
Well, we say this, but when I say that Nixon was mentally incapacitated, I don't mean that he had dementia like Trump or Biden or Reagan. It was much worse. He just got drunk every single day. All of his aides talk about it in their books, that Nixon would just get absolutely drunk. And there's this famous story where Henry Kissinger, who was, National Security Advisor and Secretary of State, suddenly gets a alarm that there is a nuclear missile that has potentially been launched against the United States. And he walks into Nixon's office to be like, we need to get into the Situation Room immediately. And Nixon is just wasted, being like, they're not gonna impeach me. They could never impeach me. They'll never do it. And he's crying. And
crying?
Yeah. And Kissinger just apparently slowly backs away, goes into the Situation Room himself, and then handles it by going, for the purposes of the next few hours, I am effectively the president, which is technically a coup. Reginald, that is a coup. That is not supposed to be the situation at all.
I mean, I can see why he would do it, but it is that's not how that works. Was he at least in the position that should have been next in line?
No, that would have been the Speaker of the House.
Oh, so they just went past they skipped succession so they didn't have to involve those icky Democrats.
Exactly. And he's not even the one after that. Technically, the Secretary of State is after the President of the Senate, which is after the Speaker of the House. And also not the Majority Leader. That's a weird tip for nerds. But okay, so this is a Republican being temporarily mentally incapacitated, right? Because theoretically, Nixon would eventually sober up and, be able to regain the duties of the president.
From the sounds of it, he would eventually sober up 2 years later.
So what would happen if you had a president who could never theoretically sober up? What if you had a president who was forever mentally incapacitated? And that's when you get our next example, Ronald Reagan, who was a president that in his second term, by all accounts, just had a raging case of dementia, just an unstoppable case. And effectively, Nancy Reagan, along with the cabinet, again started taking over the duties of the presidency. There are multiple advisors who have stories where they would go into meetings, where Nancy Reagan would meet them for the meeting. She would ask what their questions were. She would then go into a back room with the cabinet officials she needed to talk to. She would then coach Reagan to what answers he's supposed to give. She would come out with a clearly old Ronald Reagan who would give whatever answers he could until if he made a mistake, Nancy Reagan would put her hand on his knee and go, I think what he meant to say was, this man was president of the United States, and he couldn't even get through an entire meeting without his wife being like, what he meant to say was.
And even before that, he was a Hollywood actor. And if Twitter has taught me anything, those people should not be listened to.
Yes, also that. For all of the sanctimony that Republicans try to put on these kinds of conversations about national security and keep protecting the country, this is what these guys do every chance they get. This is a mental incapacity, but there was also one for a physical incapacity. Because we've had other examples. I mean, Reagan, there was an assassination attempt where he had to go under anesthesia for several hours, and George H.W. Bush did take over, and that was technically fine. There's that famous story where Reagan gets rushed to the hospital and he turns to the doctor, speaking of your jingoism, and he goes, I sure hope you're a Republican, young man. Anyway.
Yeah, which is all so gross.
Yeah.
I'm sure it was received as like, oh, he's so cheeky and charming. Yeah. But to me, that's like Donald Trump saying, why should I stop the fires in California when they didn't even vote for me?
Yeah, 100%. And that's why, that's why I wanted to bring up all these examples, because it's one of those things where it's like, as Rubio keeps taking up more seats in this cabinet, it should be easier to get rid of Trump. That's the hope. But unfortunately, precedent is just not on our side, because presidents could be basically one day away from getting, sent to an asylum, and they still would not get removed for mental incapacity. It's just not something that people want to risk.
I think that there's probably also a degree. I think that the way that politicians like to present themselves, they say, well, I'm doing this for the good of the people. I'm doing this for our nation, for our great nation. This is why I make all my decisions. When the truth is much more obvious that these are just people with jobs trying to protect their jobs and make sure that they'll have jobs in the future and position themselves for that. And I think when you look at a situation like this, there's probably a lot of people who they want to be president someday, and they wouldn't want it to be taken away from them if they had a wee bit of Alzheimer's. So why should I take it away from you? And I think that you can see the same kind of vibe, even with Democrats, where if you look at Nancy Pelosi pushing for whatever that old guy with throat cancer, his name was, when it was who's going to be the leader of the Oversight Committee. Let's not do AOC, the person who has the best means of communication of all of the Democrats. Let's go with this other guy who's really old, even though he's not healthy enough to do it, and ended up only sitting in that position for 4 months before he had to step down because he got sick again. But the whole vibe was, it's his turn. It's his time. We can't take him away from this. And I suspect that there's a lot of that with these instances too, where it's I don't want to take this away from Nixon. It's his time. He did all these things. He deserves to be there. We shouldn't take it away from him.
I think for Nixon specifically, it was more it's his time for 15 more minutes. So,
well, yeah, maybe Nixon's not the best example. That man was on a downward spiral.
Honestly, that might actually be our best chance of getting rid of Trump someday, is that if there is any group of people who doesn't respect decorum or wait your turn or this will be bad for precedent, it kind of is the Trump administration. I mean, there's a reason they're so happy to use Signal, despite every law telling them they have to keep a record of all of their conversations. These are the kinds of snakes who maybe would one day get rid of Trump for their own personal gain.
Potentially. It's one of those things where it's a boy can dream, and I kind of feel the same way about it. If there's any silver lining to their lack of decorum, that'd be a pretty sick one. I find it hard to believe that the lack of decorum extends to let's take down Trump, because at the end of the day, even if he's not president, he's still an incredibly powerful dude. And also, let's be real, at least in this term, unless he goes for a third term, realizing he's incompetent means putting J.D. Vance in charge, and I don't think anyone in the room wants to do that.
I actually do think that the thing that keeps Trump the safest amongst his own cabinet is that they hate J.D. Vance more than they hate him.
Truly. I mean, after Trump got shot and then immediately choosing J.D. Vance as his running mate, kind of makes sense. Is like, hey, who's somebody so bad that no one will want to shoot me again? Because as soon as Trump got elected, real talk, I spent several days drinking and despondent. It felt like my uncle just died and my cousin was the one that pulled the plug. And the worst part of all of it was like, they've put me in a situation where now I have to hope that Donald Trump doesn't die because J.D. Vance is also horrible.
It's at this point, we're kind of hoping for the mental incapacity. The mental incapacity is probably the only thing that keeps us from going full fascist.
How so? Because I feel like if he's mentally incapacitated to the point where people have to kind of guide him the same way that Reagan was guided or puppeted, everybody that's surrounding him was part of 2025, and they all have very clear agendas in mind. If he's not there to rein it into the sense of only if it helps me, and they can just do whatever they want, I don't know that that's going to keep us out of fascism.
I think he does rein it in. I think he reins it in on accident. I think literally this man's brain is goop, and I think some days he believes one thing and some days he believes another, and it's that incapacity that literally I think just slows down our descent into fascism. I think it is because Trump is so unreliable and so unpredictable, and he is willing to fire people behind the scenes, as you saw with Waltz, that people can't move as fast as they could if he was, say, J.D. Vance.
Which is horrifying because they are moving incredibly fast. I remember it was like a month into his term, they had already doubled their pace for completing Project 2025. They'd already hit the halfway point on Project 2025's completion, which was twice as fast as they had anticipated it being. So if you're saying that you think this is with the brakes on, yikes. So with all that in mind, when it comes to Marco Rubio, or anyone else for that matter, having multiple cabinet positions simultaneously, Sid, can they just do that?
Unfortunately, yes. The president's given large sway to organize his advisors however he wants. That's why multiple presidents are just constantly adding cabinet positions. Technically, they have the same role if they want to take them away. The president can have his advisors do whatever job they want as long as they're confirmed by the Senate, except for 3 positions. And in fact, there's actually a lot of precedent for this. Rubio isn't the first person to be the national security advisor and the secretary of state. That would be Henry Kissinger. So, Reginald, unfortunately, this is an episode where we kind of got to do a thought experiment on the 25th Amendment more than we got to do anything hopeful about Trump's recent firing.
The next question is always, is there anything we can do about that? But I suppose in this case, I just kind of mean more in the sense of, is this even a situation that's worth getting up in arms about? We replaced one bad guy with another bad guy. Is this what's the takeaway?
It's just one of those things where it's like the only thing you can really do is when there is a particularly egregious candidate who's been nominated for one of these positions, like a Mike Davis, who was the Jan 6th lawyer. Just make sure your senators understand that that's somehow crossing a line that is so far past where the line should actually be, that this has to be something where they go, no, thank you, I'm not voting for this.
Well, how about this? I'll say this. Here's what we can do, and here's my specific call to action for this. What you need to do is go out and start a fracking company, because drill, baby, drill. And you set up shop right in Washington, D.C., and hopefully we can spur this incapacity on for the first top 5 positions until we can get somebody good in office.
Honestly, that's a pretty good call to action.